You're an all-pro running back coming off a 1,500-yard season on a team who has made 2 of the past 3 conference championships. So what do you do next? Well, if you're Robert Smith, you walk away from the game. One of the purest runners of his era, Smith had an impressive yet controversial stint as a member of the Ohio State Buckeyes before finding his way to the NFL. And while the first half of his career was hampered by injury, when Smith was on the field, it was clear he was special. And by the mid-90s, the former track star was a football star for the Minnesota VIkings, a constant big play threat whose average touchdown run covered nearly 30 yards. Robert Smith was the perfect complement to the receiving duo of Cris and Randy Moss, giving Minnesota one of the league's best offenses and coming within 1 game of a Super Bowl appearance in '98. But for Robert Smith, there was more to life than football, walking away from the game at the height of his career to pursue other goals and conserve his body. But you can't help but wonder if the Vikings could have got 1 ring had Smith stayed. Let's jog your memory. Growing up in Euclid, Ohio, Robert Smith first started getting recognition as an all-around track and field star at Euclid High. But it wasn't long until opposing football teams were game planning for Smith and how to contain him, as the sophomore back would even take home a share of the league MVP. And as his coach would say, his biggest strengths weren't even his physical gifts. They were his concentration and his work ethic, which resulted in over 1,500 yards and 21 touchdowns as a junior, leading to Smith being voted the best player in Ohio. And with these kinds of credentials, Smith was getting quite a bit of recruitment attention. Yet he and one school had mutual interest from the beginning. But before he made his decision, Smith would reach another level as a senior, as the constantly improving back was arguably the country's best. And he proved that with over 2,000 yards on the ground and a Gatorade National Player of the Year award. And in the end, Smith would be going just down the road, suiting up for the Ohio State University come 1990. The local star was already well known by the time he arrived on campus, but he would quickly become a fan favorite, even running back a kick in a preseason scrimmage, with Smith almost doing it again on his first official touch versus Texas Tech.
And one of the deep men is Robert Smith, number 32, who electrified this crowd in a scrimmage when he ran it back for a touchdown. Here he comes, the debutant. Got a hole. He's got an opening.
Going on to score a touchdown in that same game, which had some calling for the freshman with 1 game under his belt to be the starter. And after a 2-0 start, Smith would get the starting nod. Then Ohio State went winless for 3 weeks, falling out of the top 25. But Smith continued to lead the ground game, and Ohio State would rattle off 5 straight wins, including a defeat of 6th-ranked Iowa and a win over Wisconsin, which saw Smith surpass the 1,000-yard mark and break 2-time Heisman winner Archie Griffin's freshman rushing record. And at this point, Smith had already planted the seed that he would leave school early to go pro, but his reasoning for it was slightly unexpected. Smith's ultimate life goal was a career in medicine, not pro football, but med school isn't cheap, so he would already say as a freshman that if he got accepted into med school, he would likely leave to go pro after his junior year. As while he appreciated his education, he knew he'd appreciate football more if he was getting some money to help pay for his future tuition. Then ending the season versus Michigan in the game, Smith would get out to a hot start, but would go on to miss most of the second half with a groin injury as he watched his Buckeyes lose the lead, then lose to the Wolverines. But nonetheless, Smith was honored as the Big Ten Freshman of the Year, and with 7 wins, Ohio State had gotten a bid to take on Air Force in the Liberty Bowl. And while Smith did score a touchdown, it was the Buckeyes' only touchdown, as he and Ohio State were mostly held in check in a 12-point upset loss, as Smith's freshman season had ended with him rushing for 1,064 yards and 7 touchdowns, while adding 93 yards through the air and being their top kick returner. But with Robert Smith leading the backfield, Ohio State looked primed for a big year in '91, until Smith walked away.
State football star Robert Smith has quit the Buckeyes.
I just had personality conflicts with some of the coaches on the team.
So in late August, Smith announced that he was quitting the football team, citing 2 big reasons for his decision in head coach John Cooper and offensive coordinator Elliot Uzelak, as Smith would explain that the way Cooper treated some of the players went completely against Smith's nature. Part of the reason Smith had chosen Ohio State was due to their campus having a medical school, and he had already made it clear that education was his top priority. So when Uzelak reportedly ordered him on multiple occasions to miss class so that he could attend practice, that was it for the star halfback. And with Smith feeling pressured to neglect his academics, he would decide to do the opposite, quitting the team to fully focus on them, while also running track in the spring, as Smith was also a sprinter on the Buckeyes track team. But the football team would be without him for the '91 season, and at one point looked like they would never be with him again, as Smith seriously considered a transfer to Stanford to play under coach Dennis Green. But after Green left for the NFL and Uzelak would step down from his position, Smith would decide to stay at Ohio State and return to play for the Buckeyes and Cooper in 1992. The Buckeyes were coming off an 8-4 season and were now led by QB Kirk Herbstreit, yet their overall offense wouldn't be anything too noteworthy. But without Smith, it would have been even worse, and his teammates knew it, so they were happy to have him back. And with general consensus around Smith still not being overly positive, it led to the junior playing with more of a chip on his shoulder, which he enjoyed. Then even with a broken rib suffered in the season opener, Smith would help Ohio State get a win over number 8 Syracuse to start the season at 3-0. And after riding a great defense to another 5-game win streak late in the year, the 8-2 Buckeyes geared up for the final game of the season against Michigan. But when the game ended, their win and loss column were the same, as the team finished this one tied 13-all, and Smith again ended the season as Ohio State's leading rusher. Yet he wasn't able to get close to his freshman yardage numbers, as he would miss a couple games due to his rib and an ankle injury. However, his 8 touchdowns were a career high, and Ohio State got a berth in the Citrus Bowl, where Smith would have a great performance to end the season, scoring 2 touchdowns. But like the Liberty Bowl, they were the only Buckeyes touchdowns, as OSU fell to Georgia, and Smith ended a second-team All-Big Ten season with 707 rush yards and 8 touchdowns, while adding 35 yards through the air and again acting as their top kick returner. Then just a few days after that Citrus Bowl loss, it was announced that Smith would again not suit up for Ohio State next year, yet this time, he was gone for good. So Smith saw an opportunity to play football at the highest level, and knew he had to take it. And while he had sat out for a season, he had come on strong at the end of the year in '92, and showed there was no rust, and that he was an NFL caliber running back. And the Minnesota VIkings seemed to agree. So they made Smith the 3rd running back off the board with the 21st pick in the 1st round of the '93 NFL draft. With Smith going late 1st round, he was able to land on a Vikings team coming off an 11-5 season, and who were coached by Dennis Green, the coach at Stanford when Smith was considering a transfer. But this Vikings offense looked much different from last year. They still had their top receiving duo of Anthony and Cris Carter, but now they had a new starting quarterback in veteran Jim McMahon. And in the backfield, the Vikings didn't need Smith, but they took the best available talent, which ended up being a great decision after their best runner from last year, Terry Allen, was lost for the season. So this opened a door for Smith. Yet Minnesota would still opt to ease him into a larger role, as he would spend most of the first half of the year behind Barry Word, while also getting an opportunity to learn from one of the best all-around backs the game had ever seen in Roger Craig. But to his frustration, Smith was used sparingly to begin his career, until getting some real action beginning in Week 6. Then a Week 9 game versus Detroit would see Smith break out, going for 115 yards and a touchdown on the ground, becoming the first Vikings rookie to record a 100-yard rushing game in nearly a decade. Then after missing a couple weeks with an ear infection, he came back as a starter. Yet after just 2 games and 129 rush yards, Smith suffered a slight tear in his ACL, ending his season, as Minnesota would finish at 9-7 before losing to the Giants in the wild card, as Smith's rookie year had seen him rush for 399 yards and 2 touchdowns, while adding 111 yards on 24 receptions. Going into '94, Minnesota had addressed their QB situation in a big way, bringing in another veteran, but this time, it was a perennial Pro Bowler in Warren Moon. And while Anthony Carter was gone, 4th-year receiver Jake Reed stepped up, and gave Moon another great target opposite Cris Carter. But then there was Smith, who would see even less play in '94. Terry Allen had a remarkable comeback from double knee surgery and would reassume his role as the lead back. Then Smith had to compete with his former college teammate Scotty Graham for second on the depth chart, with neither of them getting many touches on a Vikings offense that became one of the league's most dangerous aerial attacks, with Moon under center. Smith played a much healthier season, yet overall, he had just one game with at least 20 rush yards. Minnesota got out to a 7-2 start before losing 4 straight. And while Smith hadn't made much of an impact in the offense, he was a valuable kick returner down the stretch for a Vikings team who would finish at 10-6 and get a wildcard berth to take on Chicago, where Smith would rack up 132 return yards, including a 58-yard kick return early in the second. But he was getting so many returns because the Bears kept scoring, as Minnesota would fall to Chicago. And year 2 wrapped up with Smith rushing for 106 yards and a touchdown, while adding 15 catches for 105 more yards. But in year 3, Smith would finally get his chance to show what he had, and it looked like the Vikings had a star. During the offseason, Allen was released and left to sign with Washington, so there was now a vacancy at the starting running back position. And while Smith hadn't played much last year, he still seemed like the most obvious replacement. Yet with Allen gone, Smith wanted starter money and would stage a somewhat messy contract holdout, which would lead to him missing a lot of training camp, with the two sides eventually coming to a 1-year agreement. But with his late start, Smith wasn't the lead back in a season-opening loss. Yet after 66 yards and a touchdown on just 12 carries, he would be the starter come week 2, rushing for 111 yards and another touchdown in a win over Detroit. And over the first 7 games of the season, Smith found the end zone 5 times and went for a season-high 115 yards on just 15 carries in a win over Pittsburgh, as Smith was looking like Minnesota's back of the future and a future star in the league, as the 23-year-old was ready to be the Vikings' workhorse. But he may have spoken too soon. A sprained ankle suffered in Week 8 would limit Smith to abbreviated appearances in just 2 of their 9 remaining games. And while the Vikings continued to ride their elite passing offense after Smith went down, having one of the league's worst defenses held them back, as they finished at 8-8 and missed the playoffs, with Smith's season seeing him rush for 632 yards and 5 touchdowns, while adding 7 receptions for 35 more yards. After only signing a 1-year deal with the Vikings last year, Smith was in need of another new contract, but now had less leverage, as the soon-to-be 4th-year back was being stuck with the dreaded injury-prone label, while others had him listed as the biggest disappointment of the Vikings season. But Minnesota still didn't see him that way. And while some trade offers were coming in, they reportedly had no interest. However, Smith was showing no urgency in getting a contract figured out, as his head coach was really growing tired of Smith's holdouts. And it wasn't just his coaches who were annoyed with Smith, but eventually, the two sides would again agree on another 1-year deal. But it wouldn't hurt Smith's case when he showed up to camp 15 pounds heavier and more ready to take the beating of a full NFL season. Yet Smith would say that the added weight only made him feel quicker and faster. The Vikings looked great to begin the '96 season. Carter and Reed continued as one of the league's best receiving duos, and over the first half of the year, you couldn't look at a healthy Robert Smith and not see a star.
Robert Smith carries, big hole! Smith inside the 15, he's going in! Touchdown!
Even after again missing a lot of training camp, he rushed for over 100 yards in the season opener, and after 7 games, he was up to nearly 700 yards, and had found the end zone 3 times. And with Smith having surpassed 30 touches in 3 of those games, he obviously had the stamina to take on a workhorse role. It was just a matter of his body holding up, and in a Week 7 loss to Tampa, he had the best game of his young career, racking up 133 yards and a touchdown on the ground, as he averaged nearly 7.5 yards per carry. But in their first game coming out of the bye week, on Smith's 4th carry, he felt something in his knee. So at this point, Robert Smith looked to be heading towards the wasted talent category, a player with incredible skill, yet a body that just couldn't hold up. And while Smith had said before the season that his injuries were more bad luck than anything, he was looking like the unluckiest guy in the NFL, after suffering tears to his MCL and PCL, his second major knee injury before the age of 25. So another season came to an early end for Smith, and while the Vikings made a return to the playoffs, they were defeated by Dallas in the wild card. And even after missing half the season, Smith still finished with a team-leading 692 rush yards, along with 3 touchdowns on the ground, while adding 39 yards through the air. Smith really had the odds stacked against him now, and could have very easily hung it up, but something told Smith that this wasn't the end. It would be another offseason of back and forth contract talks, but this time, an agreement was reached much earlier, as Smith was present for training camp, and healthy for the season opener, rushing for a then career-high 169 yards and a touchdown in a win over Buffalo, with over 100 of those yards coming in the second half. But he had some new personnel around him. Warren Moon was gone, and replaced with a much younger Brad Johnson, as Minnesota's passing attack took a noticeable drop, but Robert Smith was partially responsible for that.
Johnson into the flat for Smith at the 5. Heads for the goal. They feed it to Robert Smith. Touchdown! Breaks an all-time Viking record. Here comes Robert Smith in a foot race.
Smith played and started in 14 games, a career high up to that point, but it was the way he was running that made his season so impressive. Not only was he a top 10 rusher in the league by setting a Vikings single-season record with 1,266 rush yards, but his 5.5 yards per carry were the 3rd best mark in the NFL. Smith was running behind a great O-line, but he showed a mixture of patience along with a burst through the hole that a player with 2 surgically repaired knees shouldn't have. And that sprinter speed was still there, as the last thing you wanted to do was give Robert Smith open field. So Smith would rack up 2 more 100-yard games going into the bye, but it looked like a repeat of last year when he got injured in his first game out of the bye. Yet this time, he only missed 2 games. However, after an 8-2 start, Minnesota would lose 5 straight, but 160 yards rushing from Smith in the season finale got them a win over Indy and a wildcard berth to take on New York. Smith's first playoff game as a lead back wasn't looking good, as he couldn't get anything going versus the Giants' defense, and New York went into the half with a 16-point lead, but Minnesota fought back, and a 16-yard run from Smith in the final minute gave the Vikings a chip shot field goal to complete the comeback and get Minnesota their first playoff victory in 9 years. Smith didn't do much in the divisional versus San Francisco either, but with Minnesota again falling behind big, they had to abandon the run earlier than expected. Yet this time there would be no comeback, and Smith's first healthy season ended with him rushing for 1,266 yards and 6 touchdowns, while adding 37 catches for 197 yards and 1 more touchdown. So now the Vikes had their running back, and Smith would be an important part of an unstoppable offense in 1998. But first, it was another offseason of Smith and Vikings contract drama. As while the Vikings had placed a franchise tag on him, Smith challenged the team's right to do so and keep him out of free agency. And he won, as a Vikings team who had not budgeted for a Smith bidding war had to make some cap-clearing moves. But in the end, Minnesota made Robert Smith the NFL's highest paid back. The Vikings had a new QB situation in '98. Near the end of last season, Randall Cunningham had taken over and performed, and after Brad Johnson went down early this year, Cunningham was again thrust into the starting role, as he would be handing the ball off to Smith for the rest of the season, and he still had the ever-reliable Cris Carter on one side of the field. But now on the other side, he had a 6'4" freak of nature out of Marshall University named Randy Moss, and Smith knew how good the Vikings were, as to him, the '98 season was Super Bowl or bust. The 1998 Vikings offense was historic, scoring a league record 556 points. And while a lot of the credit tends to go to Moss's record-breaking rookie season and the overall lethality of Minnesota's passing attack, Robert Smith deserves more than he gets, not only for what he was able to do as a runner, but also how good of a fit he was in that offense. Although he was never a bell cow, Smith was showing that he could handle a solid workload on the ground and could pick up good chunks of yards on each carry, which forced defenses to play up, and then a play action, or even flea flicker, equaled big yards for the Vikings. And conversely, Smith was a home run hitter himself, always a threat to break a long run. And if defenses were focused on the deep ball, Smith could take a screen pass downfield to get Minnesota just as many yards, and sometimes a touchdown. Week 2 would see Smith go for a career-high 179 yards on the ground in a win over St. Louis. Then a 134-yard performance in Week 8 would secure a 7-0 start for the Vikings. And while they would lose a close one to Tampa Bay the following week, that was their only loss, with the Vikings running the table the rest of the way. And while Smith missed a couple of games late in the year with knee issues, it was nothing serious, as he again played 14 games and was finally shedding the injury-prone label and gaining a new distinction of Pro Bowler after being added as an injury replacement. And the Vikings won 15 games and entered a divisional round matchup with Arizona. And after last year's playoffs, Smith wanted redemption, which he would get in the form of 124 rush yards to help put the Vikings in better position for one of their 5 touchdowns on the day, as now the only thing standing between them and a Super Bowl berth were the Atlanta Falcons. This game had been a much different story for Minnesota. The Vikings had scored, but not at their usual breakneck pace, and Smith had been largely shut down for the entire game. But on the Vikings' final drive of regulation, with the team up by 7, Smith accounted for 45 yards to get the Falcons in position for a very manageable 38-yard field goal for Gary Anderson, a kicker who hadn't missed a single kick of any kind all season.
So that's a pretty good bet if you say, do you think Gary Anderson will make this field goal? The answer should probably be yes.
39 yards away, and it's not good.
But the unthinkable happened, and after the miss, Atlanta drove down the field and sent the game to overtime. But the Vikings were without Smith, who had injured his knee on that fourth quarter drive and wouldn't return. Then after both teams got multiple chances in the extra period, the Falcons would end the Vikings' dream season, as Smith ended his year by rushing for 1,187 yards and 6 touchdowns, while adding 28 receptions for 291 yards and 2 more touchdowns. So last season had ended in the ultimate disappointment, but the Vikings still had all the pieces to roll out another offense like last year. Yet as the season went on, Cunningham was regressing, eventually leading to him being pulled at halftime of a Week 6 loss to Detroit in favor of Jeff George. But things could have been worse, as George had a great arm and would have a bit of a redemption year after a rough season in Oakland the year prior. But it helps when you have the best receiver duo in football and a Pro Bowl running back. Smith didn't have a great start to the season, but with Cunningham struggling and the team as a whole adjusting to a new offensive coordinator in Ray Sherman, this was understandable. And after a hernia sidelined Smith for 3 games, he returned to a Vikings team in the midst of a 3-game win streak and helped them extend that streak to 5 games. As post-injury, Smith averaged nearly 100 yards per game and eclipsed the 1,000-yard mark for the 3rd straight season. And after a 2-4 start, Minnesota lost just 2 more times, as their 10-6 record was enough for a wildcard matchup with Dallas, where Smith would have the best playoff game of his career. Dallas was up 10-3 after 1, but early in the second, with Minnesota facing a 3rd and 25 from the Dallas 26, Smith would take a pass all the way to the end zone to tie the game, as he accumulated 58 yards through the air. Then on the ground, he had a playoff career-high 140 yards, as the Vikings pulled away in the second half and advanced to the divisional to take on another historic offense in the St. Louis Rams. Smith would have nearly 100 yards from scrimmage in this game, and Minnesota actually went into halftime with the lead, but they would completely collapse in the 3rd quarter and spent the rest of the game playing catch-up, yet came up short after allowing 49 points to St. Louis, as Smith's year had seen him rush for 1,015 yards and 2 touchdowns, while adding 24 catches for 166 more yards through the air. But the new millennium would bring the best version of Robert Smith. George and Cunningham were gone come the following season, as the team was moving forward with 2nd-year QB Dante Culpepper. And like usual, the Vikings had 2 of the best receivers in the game, as Carter continued to perform even at 35 years old. And then there was Smith, who in year 8 would finally play a full 16 games, as his 1,521 rush yards would lead the NFC and be the 2nd most yards in the NFL, while his 5.2 yards per carry would also be the 2nd highest in the league. as overall, whether it was rush yards, receiving yards, or touchdowns, the 28-year-old back was putting up career-best numbers across the board. Smith began the season with over 100 yards on the ground and never looked back, and it was shades of 98, with the Vikings jumping out to a 7-0 start, yet they would only win 4 more games after this. However, all 4 of those wins came during a 5-game stretch, which saw Smith surpass 100 yards rushing in each game, as Smith garnered his second career Pro Bowl selection, along with a second-team All-Pro selection. But with the Vikings stumbling near the end and losing their final 3, they fell to 11-5 on the year, yet this was still good for the NFC's second-best record and a playoff bye. Smith would be an effective source of offense in the divisional round versus the Saints, racking up nearly 100 yards from scrimmage and a fourth-quarter touchdown to put the game out of reach, as Minnesota was moving on to their second NFC championship in 2 years, this time to take on New York. But this would be one of the most embarrassing losses in Vikings history, with a normally average Giants offense putting up 41 points on Minnesota, and with Culpepper committing 4 turnovers, the Vikings offense never stood a chance, as Smith's 69 yards from scrimmage were a drop in the bucket in a huge shutout loss. But Smith still wrapped his career year with 1,521 rush yards and 7 touchdowns, while adding 36 receptions for 348 yards and 3 more touchdowns. So the loss was tough, but Robert Smith had just played the best and healthiest season of his career, and overall had 4 straight 1,000-yard seasons under his belt, as the halfback clearly still had a lot of good football left in him. Soon after the Giants game, Smith would undergo surgery on his knee, the 3rd major knee surgery of his career, which revealed more damage than originally thought, and the long-term effects of these accumulating injuries and surgeries were concerning Smith. So on February 8, 2001, about 2 months from his 29th birthday, Robert Smith left what was likely to be a big payday in free agency on the table, and instead, the Vikings' all-time leading rusher retired from the NFL, as years later, he would explain that it was more important to him to be able to walk without issue and not need full-on knee replacements in his 40s. And while it was tough to leave the game, once Smith had children, he was able to play with them without issue, and that was enough to know that he made the right decision. And retiring also allowed Smith to take on other endeavors, as in his post-playing days, the well-spoken Smith has spent plenty of time as an analyst, while also starting up his own foundation to help support children's hospitals and medical research. However, it wasn't all smooth sailing for Smith, as he had struggled with a controlled alcohol problem in the final years of his career, picking and choosing which nights to drink so as to not affect his play. But once he retired, he had nothing but free time, and no longer had to worry about his on-field performance. And over the next decade, his drinking would get out of control. But just days before his son was born in 2012, Smith made another attempt at sobriety, and this time it stuck, as Smith is now in a better place and continues to live an unsurprisingly quiet life post-football. Robert Smith had priorities, and while football was one of them, he always knew football wasn't everything, even from his days at Ohio State, where he chose academics first. Then once Smith arrived in the NFL, it seemed like it would be not for long, after injuries destroyed his first 4 seasons. But he never lost motivation and always believed in himself, until finally breaking through in the late 90s, becoming a crucial but often overlooked piece of some incredible Vikings offenses. Smith was a big play threat whenever he touched the ball, and had one of the smoothest running strides you'd ever see. But in an era where running backs were bell cows, Smith wasn't that same workhorse, and on a team with 2 future Hall of Famers at receiver, Smith fell into the shadows. But a healthy Robert Smith was one of the best backs of the 90s, and the dimension he added to the Vikings offense cannot be undersold. But that's it for today's episode on Robert Smith. Hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to subscribe for more videos like this one. If you liked it, check out this one on one of his old quarterbacks, or this one on one of his draft mates. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.